Good afternoon. Thank you for coming back. It's great to be here with you again. So this morning I talked about how Asian America and the world of cartooning kind of intersected. To now, during the afternoon session, I want to talk to you about how I became each of these things. How I became an Asian American and how I became a cartoonist. So I became an Asian American by being born. I was born to Asian parents in America. My parents are both immigrants. My dad was born in Taiwan, my mom in mainland China. And I grew up in a family of stories. Both my mom and my dad loved telling stories. My brother and I, we both loved listening to their stories. My parents mostly told stories out of the culture that they left. And I think this is true of a lot of immigrant households, right? The parents tell stories to their kids as a way of keeping that culture alive, as a way of connecting with the country that they left. So most of the stories that my parents told me were about China and about Taiwan. My dad mostly made stories up off the top of his head. His stories were all about this little Taiwanese village boy named Atong. And Atong's, like my favorite Atong stories were all about these really gross chores that his dad would make him do. So for instance, my absolute favorite when I was 6 years old was about how Atong's dad would hand him a bowl and a pair of chopsticks and make him go outside the front of their house, and he'd have to pick up cow manure with his chopsticks and stick it inside of his bowl. When I was 6, I thought that was hilarious. Actually, to be honest, I still kind of think it's hilarious. As an adult, I look back on these stories that my dad told me, and I think he told me these stories as a way of getting me to be grateful that he wasn't making me do those same sorts of chores. But that was completely lost on me. My mom took a more traditional route. So when I was really little, her parents were still living in Asia. She asked them to send over a whole bunch of Chinese language storybooks. And she would read these books to me at bedtime. The way I made the slide was I actually pulled these books off of my bookshelf and scanned them in. So these are actual books that my mom used to read to me. I had a realization about my mom's stories as well after I became an adult. And that is how different they are from most of the stories that most kids in America hear. So here's an example. This is an actual storybook from my childhood bookshelf. Can you see what's going on? So just to be clear, there is a young woman, a young mother, who is breastfeeding her own mom. Her own mom's gotten so old that she's lost all of her teeth and she's kind of slowly starving to death. So this young woman breastfeeds her own mom while her toddler is crying in the corner because he's hungry. This was a collection of short stories aimed at kids 5, 6, 7 years old, all about filial piety, about respecting and caring for your elders. I am pretty sure if you go to your local Barnes & Noble, you're not going to find an English translation of this book. Now, of all of my mom's stories, my absolute favorite were about the Monkey King. The Monkey King is this old Chinese legendary figure, and he has a lot of appeal, especially for a little boy, right? Boys love monkeys. If you used to be a boy, looking deep inside your heart, you're going to find a love of monkeys there. And boys also love violence. You know this is true. So the Monkey King combined these two things. He's like a kung fu fighting monkey, perfect for a little boy. Like an American superhero, he can call a cloud down from the sky and ride it around like a skateboard. He can grow and shrink with the slightest thought. He can pull a hair off of his head and blow on it, and it will become a clone of himself. And my favorite when I was a kid, he has this magic stick that he beats people with. So normally he keeps his stick about the size of a toothpick tucked behind his ear. When he needs to fight, he'll pull it out, it'll grow into a staff, he'll hit somebody over the head with it, and then he'll shrink it back down and tuck it back behind his ear. When I was a kid, I thought the Monkey King was the absolute coolest. He was my absolute favorite. A lot of times my mom would ask me, at bedtime, she'd say, do you want to hear about the Monkey King, or do you want to hear about that young lady who breastfeeds her own mom? I would always choose the Monkey King. I love the Monkey King so much that he was a big part of American-born Chinese. He's about a third of the book, so he influences me to this very day. So I grew up in a household of stories. I also grew up in a community of stories. I grew up going every Sunday to St. Clair's Church, which is about half an hour south of San Francisco. This was a Catholic community, and it was a large Catholic community made up of small ethnic communities. One of these small communities was a Chinese Catholic congregation. This church, in a lot of ways, embodies who I am. It is both Catholic and it is Chinese. Those are the two big pieces that make up who I am. And it is also a community of stories. I think, faith communities in general, religion in general, are communities of stories. They're storytelling communities. They're a group of people who get together on a regular basis to tell each other stories. And these stories help us make sense of our lives, help us make sense of the world and of the universe. As a person of faith, I think faith is more than just stories, but I definitely don't think it's any less than stories. Stories are an essential core of what faith is all about. So this was a storytelling community. It told lots of both Catholic and Chinese stories. And when I was a kid, I didn't really see a conflict between these two pieces of who I was. I didn't see a conflict between Western faith and Eastern culture, right? Usually when people were talking about Jesus and God around me, they were doing it in Chinese. It was only later, after I became an adult, that I realized historically this just wasn't the case. If you go back 100 years, most people believed that Eastern culture and Western faith were fundamentally incompatible. This was starkly illustrated for me in the year 2000. That year, Pope John Paul II canonized a group of Chinese Catholic saints. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Roman Catholicism, canonization is this process that the Catholic Church uses to sort of highlight certain lives of its members. It's the Catholic Church's way of saying these particular lives show God's love in a very specific and special way. They're worthy of study and worthy of imitation. So in the year 2000, the Vatican canonizes a group of Chinese Catholic saints. This is the very first time the Roman Catholic Church, this deeply Western institution, had honored Chinese citizens in this way. My home church flipped out about it. They freaked out. There was all sorts of special masses. There were celebrations galore. We had tons of food flying through the church for like a month. Giant trays of egg rolls everywhere. Like, you know this, right? Whenever you see a giant tray of egg rolls, Chinese people are happy about something. So these festivities, they inspired me to look into the lives of these newly canonized saints. And what I discovered was that many of them had been martyred during the Boxer Rebellion, during this war that was fought on Chinese soil in the year 1900. And they were martyred specifically because back then, if you were Chinese and you converted to any form of Christianity, you were seen as a traitor. You were seen as somebody who turned your back on your family, your nation, your culture, your people. In fact, when the Vatican made its announcement, the official Chinese government actually wrote a letter of protest. They said the Catholic Church was honoring a group of traitors. I found this conflict so interesting that I spent a long time just looking at it. I wanted to do a project about it. And out of this came Boxers and Saints, which to date is my most ambitious book, a 2-volume graphic novel all about the Boxer Rebellion. This book took me 6 years to do. It totaled over 500 pages. I don't know if I'm ever going to do a book as long as this one. So, just over 100 years ago, Western religion, Eastern culture were seen by most people as fundamentally incompatible. Now, things got a little bit more complicated, right, as time went on, especially as more and more Chinese, more and more Asians made their way onto the American shores. Early on, Chinese immigrants, I'm sure this is true of most Asian immigrants, they had a hard time sending their kids to American public schools after they got here. They found that the American public schools were inhospitable to their kids. A lot of times they just weren't even allowed to go. And when they were allowed to go, they faced a lot of prejudice and persecution. So a lot of Christian missionaries would go into American Chinatowns to establish schools for these children of Chinese immigrants. These schools ended up being extremely effective tools for evangelization. A lot of early Chinese American Christian communities were actually centered around these schools, right? And these communities ended up becoming these flourishing churches. Now, these churches were not just about faith. They were also about cultural preservation. So it kind of flipped. In the early 1900s, Chinese culture and Christian faith were seen as diametrically opposed. As time went on, Christian faith ended up undergirding Chinese culture. So the parents who grew up, who were raising their kids in these Chinese communities, didn't just want their kids to grow up to be Christian, they also wanted their kids to grow up to be Chinese. Now, this was certainly true of St. Clair's, where I grew up. It was a very Catholic place, but the way we celebrated Catholicism, the way we lived out our Catholicism, had a definite Chinese edge to it. So there were egg rolls at every Easter and egg rolls at every Christmas. Santa was this chubby Chinese guy. There's a day on the Catholic liturgical calendar called All Souls Day. And the way my church celebrated All Souls Day was basically the exact same way that Chinese had been honoring their ancestors for centuries and centuries and centuries. Incense and all. So it was definitely a very Chinese place. But faith did play a central role. A lot of the adults that I grew up around, Jesus was definitely the center of their lives. So I don't want to make it just about culture, right? This was about both. So a lot of people at my church, Jesus was very important. I was not one of those people. When I was growing up, Jesus was somebody I basically thought about on Sundays in that church. And for the rest of the week, I thought about other stuff. Things like Disney cartoons. When I was a kid, I loved cartoons. I loved watching cartoons in the movie theater. I loved watching cartoons on TV. In fact, when I was really young, my ambition was to work for this guy right here. In third grade, our teacher made us do these biography reports. I chose to do mine on Walt Disney. Is it acting funny? Okay, thanks. My ears are an odd shape. I think that's why. Okay, is that better? Awesome. Okay, so we had to do these biography reports. I chose to do mine on Walt Disney, and after that, I got kind of obsessed with him. I remember, going to the library and checking out as many books about Walt Disney as I could. I remember practicing drawing in that classic Disney style, because I figured I ought to practice for my future job. I remember going to the encyclopedia and looking up the date of Walt Disney's death, because I was hoping it would match my birth date, because that would mean I might be his reincarnation. That did not work out. That didn't work out. I remember going to the local mall, and there was this poster store, and I had to special order this poster-sized headshot of Walt Disney. So not Disneyland, not any of the Disney characters, Walt Disney's head. And I hung that up in my bedroom. My friends would come over, and they'd be like, "Why do you have this picture of a creepy old man in your bedroom?" And I have to tell them, that's not just any creepy old man. That's Walt Disney. So this all changed one night when I was in 5th grade, and my mom took me to our local bookstore. When I was little, every local bookstore used to have this spinner rack. It was a wireframe rack, and it would carry a month's worth of comics. You could spin them so that you could see them all. Before this night, I'd probably seen comic books before, and I may have even read them before. But for some reason, on this night, I saw this issue of Marvel 2-in-1 sitting on that spinner rack. And as soon as I saw this cover, it's like something snapped inside of me. I knew from the depths of my being that I had to own it. I don't know what it was about this cover. Marvel 2-in-1 is a series that Marvel Comics doesn't really publish anymore. But this is where they would take the Thing, who is one of their most popular characters, this giant orange rock monster, and pair him up with some other character. So in this issue, he was paired up with Rom the Space Knight. Anyone know who Rom the Space Knight is? Yeah, Rom the Space Knight, time has not been very kind to. Nobody remembers him anymore. He's a superhero that's like part robot. He fights crime mostly in outer space. I don't know what it was about this image that captured my imagination. I think just the fact that these two characters look so different from each other. One's a rock monster, one's a robot guy. It doesn't seem like they should be friends, but they are. So I brought this issue up to my mom. I said, "Mom, from the depths of my being, I'd like to own this. Can you please buy it for me?" And she took one look at this cover, and she said, "No, absolutely not. Those two characters look way too scary, and they're going to give you nightmares." She made me put this back on the spinner rack. To this day, I have no idea what this story is all about. Now, my mom wanted to be a good mom, so she bought me another comic book. She bought me the latest Superman comic, a DC Comics Presents, number 57. Even though I write Superman now, when I was a kid, I was not a big fan. She bought this for me because Superman is basically every parent's favorite superhero, right? He's not scary looking at all, unlike Rom and the Thing. He's actually kind of good looking. He always does the right thing. He never says any bad words. He doesn't punch anybody unless he really, really has to, and afterwards he feels kind of bad about it. He flies around Metropolis in this blue uniform. He's like this giant flying Boy Scout running around looking for good deeds to do. Well, I was disappointed, but I brought this book home and I read it. And in this book, the atomic bomb drops in 1986. It's 1984 as I'm reading it. So the atomic bomb drops. It kills off most of the people on the planet. The few remnants of humanity that are left, they gather themselves in these little societies that are pretty lawless because all the police are dead. So a group of men have to get together, dress up in medieval-style armor, and ride around on these giant mutated dogs to fight crime. They call themselves the Atomic Knights. Superman, being Superman, is one of the survivors. He teams up with these Atomic Knights, and they have this adventure together. And in the last few pages of this book, it's revealed that the whole thing is just a dream that somebody's having. But that didn't stop this from completely freaking me out. I stayed up nights thinking about it. Thinking about the bomb, because it was the 80s, everybody was thinking about the bomb. Thinking about Superman and mutated dogs and Atomic Knights. And about comic books, about how this combination of words and pictures did something inside of my brain that neither words nor pictures had been able to do before. Pretty soon after that, I went from being a comic book reader to comic book creator. And this is one of my favorite parts about being in comics, is that dividing line between who is a professional and who's an amateur, who is a fan and who is a creator, is very thin, very blurry, and very permeable. If you want to be a comic book creator, all you need to do is go home tonight, pull out some paper, pull out some pens, and draw a comic, and there you are. You're a comic book creator. That's exactly what I did when I was in 5th grade. I had this friend in 5th grade. His name was Jeremy Kunyoshi, half Jewish, half Japanese kid, which turns out to be a pretty awesome, cultural heritage for being a comic book geek. But he had been collecting comics for years by then. He had collected comics since he started to read. By the time we were in 5th grade, he actually had these boxes and boxes of comics underneath his bed. And together, we started making comics together. When our more athletic friends were playing kickball at lunch, we would sit at the lunch tables and we would brainstorm stories. Then I would do all the pencils, he would do all the inks. We'd give our final art to his mom, who would take him to work, wait till all her coworkers went home, and sneak photocopies for us. Then we took these photocopies, we'd staple them by hand, we sold them to our friends for 50 cents a piece. At the end of the day, we made $8. It was awesome. When I was a kid, the Statue of Liberty was actually going through these issues. They'd run these ads during after-school cartoons about how her nose was about to rust off, and they asked for donations. Jeremy and I, we love America. So we decided to donate our $8 to the Restore the Statue of Liberty Fund. Our 5th grade teacher was so proud of us, she gave us these McDonald's gift certificates that were worth more than $8. To this day, that is my best decision as a cartoonist, my best financial decision as a cartoonist. Jeremy has since given up on comics. He is now a radiologist. He makes a lot of money. He lives in a big house in Hawaii. Good for him. I kept making comics. I kept making comics through the 5th grade, through the 6th grade. In 7th grade, I had this friend. I had this friend who was better than me in every way one human being can be better than another. So he was taller, he was better looking, he had better grades, he was smarter, he was more athletic. Most of us in 7th grade, we had a hard time getting just one girlfriend. This guy had 6 in a row. One day, he sees me reading comic books, and he walks up to me and he says, if you keep reading those things, you will never get a girlfriend. In 7th grade, I knew from the depths of my being that I wanted a girlfriend. So I listened to him. I gave up on comics. I took all the money that I was going to spend on comics, and I bought this instead. So, I grew up in the 80s. If you wanted to be awesome in the 80s, you had to have a denim jacket. I also learned how to do this with my pants. This is called pegging. And I can't believe it, but people are actually doing this again. It's kind of crazy. I feel like I'm in junior high again. So I pegged my pants, I put on my denim jacket, and then I went to school and I waited for the ladies to come. I waited through the 7th grade, through the 8th grade, through the 9th grade. In 10th grade, I looked myself in the mirror and I said, Gene, you gotta face facts. This girlfriend thing is just not gonna happen. So there I was, no girlfriend, no comic books, and I thought, man, I can do something about one of these things. So I started collecting comic books again. And I collected with a fervor that I just hadn't had when I was younger. These are some of my favorite comics when I was in high school. The Hulk back then was being written by this guy named Peter David. When I was really little, I hated the Hulk. I thought he was a really stupid character. Big, green guy, super strong, kind of dumb, always says Hulk smash. Seems very uninteresting. In high school, when I was in high school, Peter David made the Hulk green, super strong, and he also made him super smart and kind of evil. And that made him interesting. So what do you do if you're super strong, green, kind of evil? Well, you hire yourself out as like a hitman. That's what you do. That was what the Hulk was when I was in high school. It's kind of awesome. I was also really into The Spirit, which was done by Will Eisner, who I talked about earlier, the godfather of American comics. These were reprints from the 1940s, but they were amazing. He was well ahead of his time. And then in high school, I was also really into Uncle Scrooge, which is probably why I couldn't get a girlfriend. Now, my parents watched me do this. They watched me dive back into this habit that I had given up when I was in junior high, and they were really concerned. They sat me down and they said, "You're about to go to college. You're about to become an adult. What are you doing buying these funny books again? You need to think more carefully about your life." Well, I eased their concerns by getting into UC Berkeley. I went there in the summer of 1991. And Berkeley, college in general, was just a huge time of growth for me. It was a growth for me as a human being. It was growth for me in my identity. And specifically, I grew both in my understanding of faith and in my understanding of culture. I told you earlier, at UC Berkeley, that was when I stopped calling myself Oriental, and I learned to call myself Asian American. That was when I realized that, America is not a monolithic culture, that America, from its foundation, has been a collection of subcultures, and the Asian American subculture is a vital part of that. That's how I grew. That's how I came to kind of embrace this Asian American label for me. That was also when I joined this parachurch group called InterVarsity. Now, InterVarsity is largely an evangelical organization, but the Berkeley chapter, while I was there in the early 90s, I don't know how it is now, I haven't visited in a long time, but it had a lot of Catholic tinges. People were really into Mother Teresa, people read a lot of Henry Nouwen, so as a Catholic, I felt pretty at home there. Through InterVarsity, that was also the first time that I met people my age who took their faith, who took the gospel call seriously. And I found that really, really inspiring. I actually kind of think that my experience at the Berkeley chapter of InterVarsity was a little bit the opposite of what Phil talked about. The people that I knew around me, they took Jesus' call and they heard something very social justice-y in it. For example, a lot of the folks that I went to college with, shortly after graduating, they moved into the murder doves of Oakland, which is one of the roughest parts of the city. They moved in to join a community called New Hope. And a lot of them, 20 years later, are still there. They are raising kids there. They're fully invested in that community. What they wanted to do was they wanted to find Jesus among the refugee communities in the murder doves. So I was deeply, deeply inspired by these people. And in the context of InterVarsity, that's when Jesus became more than just a Sunday thing for me. That's when I realized that if God was real, if these things I had professed to believe since I was a kid were real, then they really ought to occupy a central place in my life. So in college, I learned to take my identity as an Asian American more seriously. I learned to take my faith in Christ more seriously. And there was actually a conflict there, right? There is a conflict between Eastern culture and Eastern cultural heritage and a Western faith. As I went through college, I felt this tension more and more acutely. And I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of like a tiny, shadowy version of that old tension dating back to the 1800s between Eastern culture and Western faith. The part of my life that this tension became most acute in was when I was considering these two different questions. What should I major in, and what career should I pursue? I think my Eastern cultural heritage and my Western faith seem to have very, very different things to say about these two questions. So, my cultural heritage, my parents aren't like super, super hardcore, but they are kind of hardcore. My mom is generally more understanding. My dad is much more of a typical immigrant dad. He definitely wanted me to be an Asian and not a Bijan. He definitely believed in the Chinese Trinity. You know, he had really, really strong opinions about what I should do with my major, what I should do with my career, what should I do with my life. So what did my Eastern cultural heritage tell me about my dad's opinions? Well, it told me that I had to take them very, very seriously, right? And I don't even know, to be honest, I don't even know if it's like that in modern China, if modern Chinese people feel this way, right? But my understanding of Eastern culture, as it was reflected in my household, that told me my parents, specifically my dad's opinions, had a lot of weight to it. I say this because, you know, I'm married to that Korean American, and when her cousins come to visit her family from Korea, they often tell her, wow, you know, walking into your family's home is kind of like walking into Korea in the 1960s. So Korea is very different now than it was when her parents left. I'm sure China and Taiwan are very different now from when my parents left. But in the cultural context that I understood, in the experience of Eastern cultural heritage that I had in the walls of my home, it felt like my parents, my dad's opinion had a lot of weight to it. So what did Western faith say about this? What did Western faith say about my dad's opinion? When I was in college, there was this dude that walked around campus, and he was kind of a minor local celebrity. He was known as the Hate Man. He was a homeless guy. He had this really gruff appearance, but if you talked to him, you would find that he was actually a very thoughtful and compassionate person. He was called the Hate Man because he would walk around campus with this cardboard sign with giant letters saying, "Hate your mom." And then underneath that would be smaller letters saying, "Luke 14:26." So the Hate Man was actually quoting Jesus. Within a Western framework, it seemed like I was told to hate my parents, right? At least ignore their opinion. And I think for a lot of us, a lot of Christians of Eastern descent, sometimes faith can be a way we can escape our parents' expectations and legitimize that escape. I think I struggled with this when I was in college. I think I really worried about this. So it seemed like, for these questions, what should I major in and what career should I pursue? I got really different sets of advice from Western faith and from Eastern culture. The West seemed to tell me that I should follow my passion, that my self-actualized being is the most important thing. And the East seemed to tell me that I ought to follow the advice of my parents. My parents have been around longer. They have accumulated wisdom that I ought to tap, and I really need to weigh their opinions pretty heavily. In terms of money, the West told me, do what you love, and the money will follow. Follow your passions, the finances will work themselves out. And the East seemed to tell me, I got a plan. I got to make sure I can secure my own financial future. The West seemed to tell me that my ultimate goal in life was to fulfill my dreams. And the East seemed to tell me that my ultimate goal in life was to fulfill my responsibilities. In the West, the individual, the I, seemed like it was the most important thing. In the East, it seemed like my place and my family and my community was the most important thing. So I felt this keen tension between East and West inside of me, especially when I considered my future. Looking back, I don't think that Jesus was actually one of the anchors of this tension. I would argue that the anchor was actually American Jesus, and that a more authentic understanding of Christ sets him maybe apart from this tension. So I had this friend in college. Her name was Pauline Chen. It is now Pauline Chen Fong. She's an area director in the Pacific Northwest now for InterVarsity. And what she did was she loved to pray for people. That was like her hobby. Like the rest of us would be watching TV and she'd be sitting there praying. And what she would do is she'd give these little notes to you. Like she'd walk up to you when she saw you on campus and she'd hand you this little note and she'd say, I was praying for you and this is what came up. And she'd give you this little note. So one day I got this note from Pauline and I still have this note. It's still tucked inside of my Bible. And at the top of the note, it says Psalm 139. So Psalm 139 is a psalm all about divine will. It's the search and know, we are all fearfully and wonderfully made. It's that psalm, you know. And since then, largely because of this little note that I got from Pauline, this has become one of my favorite parts of the Old Testament. I got a lot of problems with a lot of the Old Testament, but I do like this part. And I like it so much that I actually included it in American-born Chinese. So I do have this one panel where the words of this panel are actually a paraphrase of Psalm 139. You know, part of the reason why Psalm 139 became important to me is because when I was in college, it seemed like a lot of my Asian and Asian American friends were coming into Western faith. You know, if you went to any Christian parachurch organization, if you walked into any church near campus, any Christian church near campus, it'd just be black hair everywhere. And I always wondered why that was. I wonder if Psalm 139 gives us a little clue, you know? A lot of us Asian Americans, we grow up feeling like we don't really fit with the culture of our parents. We don't really fit with the American culture that's around us. So two people who have a hard time finding a home for themselves in the cultures that surround them, this idea of divine intention, that somebody meant for you to be who you are, can be a very powerful one. And it's an idea that is largely absent from the traditional Eastern faiths, right? So I wonder if there's a connection there. Now, the second thing that Pauline wrote about in that note was she wrote, "You have been called, choose to obey your calling." And then she wrote in smaller print, she said, "There's more that I think God wants to say to you, but I can't seem to know what it is." Thanks a lot, Pauline. That's the best. Vague prayer notes are the best. But this word that she uses, calling, I think gives a larger context to these two questions of major and career. What you choose to study, what you choose to do to earn a living, it seems like it fits into a larger question of what is your calling. How do you make the important decisions about your life, right? How do you make the most important decisions about your life? This hate your mom quote from the Hate Man does have its root in an actual Bible verse. I'm going to read it to you in its entirety. So from Luke 14:26, he says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." So there is that thing. This feels like an escape hatch, right? An escape hatch away from your parents' expectations, right there in the middle of the Gospel of Luke. But this has to be balanced against this quote. This is from Mark 8:34. "If any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." So Jesus does say to hate your mom, but he also says to deny yourself. So an authentic understanding of Jesus doesn't allow us that escape hatch away from our parents' expectations into our actualized self. That's not where we're supposed to go. So he follows it up with follow me. So what does that mean? Follow me. Like, have you ever talked to somebody who didn't grow up in church and told them that you follow Jesus? Like, have you had that conversation with somebody? It's a weird thing to say. Like, there's no physical person for you to follow. There's no Twitter account that you can follow, right? What does it mean to follow Christ? Well, I don't know if I have a great answer for this, but I'm going to answer it from the perspective of a storyteller, from the perspective of somebody who loves story. So as a story, in the Gospels as a whole, Jesus Christ is a great Christ figure, like one of the best in all of human literature, right? I think maybe Gandalf, maybe Superman are better, but Jesus Christ, great Christ figure. And as a Christ figure, he embodies this idea. I talked about this earlier, but what Pope John Paul II refers to as a self-donating love. He embodies this idea of loving somebody else to the point where you give yourself to them, where you donate yourself to them. So this question of what is my calling can really be rephrased as how can I live out self-donating love? And when you think about it like this, maybe a lot of the other stuff about the specifics of major, the specifics of career, maybe they kind of lessen in importance. So how do you figure this out? How do you figure out how to live out self-donating love. Now, if you had asked me this when I was in my mid-20s, my early to mid-20s, I would have had a very definitive answer for you. But since then, I've been relatively bruised up by life. And I think I'm not as sure. I'm not as sure about how to answer this. I will tell you what I did, though. So this is what I did. I graduated from UC Berkeley. I majored in something that pleased my dad. I majored in computer science. But I did also minor in creative writing, which I got to tell you has been enormously helpful to me as a comic book writer. And a year or two after I graduated, I went on this silent retreat. It was held at the Presentation Center, which was just outside of Santa Cruz. It was run by this priest who invested a lot of time and energy into the youth of the St. Clair's Chinese Catholic community. It was a silent retreat. I think it was like 5 days long. So for 5 days, I didn't talk to anybody except for the spiritual director, except for this priest, Father Malatesta. I'd meet with them for about half an hour a day, and we'd just talk. And that was my only time talking. So I'm not saying that you got to do that. I'm not even saying I'm ever going to do that ever again, because it was hard. But out of that 5-day period, I made 2 decisions. One of the decisions was to start teaching high school. So I had a job as a computer programmer for a little bit. I left that job and I became a computer science teacher at Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California. We are, to my mind, the best high school in the East Bay, just saying. We're most well known for our basketball, volleyball, and football teams. As a computer science teacher, I had very little to do with the basketball, volleyball, and football teams. I left Bishop O'Dowd just this past June, and I have to tell you, when I left, it was hard. It was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. It really felt like I was breaking up with somebody. I actually lost sleep, and I couldn't eat for like 2 days. You know, like I haven't broken up with a girlfriend in a long time, but that's exactly what it felt like. Even now, I think I still feel like I miss this community. It felt good to be a part of something bigger than me. So that was one of the decisions that I made. I made the decision to start teaching at Bishop O'Dowd High School. The second decision that I made was to get more serious about comic books. So I started drawing comics. I started getting involved in the comic book community a little bit more seriously. This right here, Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks, was the very first comic that I ever did as an adult. I did it as a self-published project. It's about a young man who gets a spaceship stuck in his nose and becomes friends with the alien that's driving the ship. And then he learns all these deep life lessons. Now, this actually is based on my own life. I've never had a spaceship stuck in my nose, but I do have a lifelong struggle with sinus issues. For some reason, one of my nostrils is always plugged up. It's the left one right now, in case you're wondering. And if you have sinus problems, you know that it's just horrible, right? And the most horrible thing is that there's nobody to blame. It's never anybody's fault. It's just somebody you're born with and you just have to struggle with. Well, one day I thought, man, what if it was somebody's fault? What if there was something sentient that was actually plugging up my nose? And that's how Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks was born. Gordon Yamamoto and the King of the Geeks was a ton of fun to do, largely because I actually didn't have to pay to self-publish this. You all know who the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are, right? So the Turtles were actually created by these 2 self-publishing cartoonists. They were both dirt poor. I think one of them was living in his mom's basement. So they get together, they draw the first issue of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they cobble together a few $1,000s, they put it out as a black and white comic. Within 5 years, the Turtles had become this multinational, multimedia phenomenon with cartoons and toys and movies and comic books, and these 2 guys became multimillionaires. So one of the guys took his millions of dollars and he bought a Sherman tank. He bought the Batmobile from that Tim Burton Batman movie from 1989. And the other guy took his millions of dollars and he founded a nonprofit organization called the Xeric Foundation. So for years, the nonprofit organization would actually give out grants to self-publishing cartoonists. It was this guy's way, the Turtles guy's way, of giving back to his roots. So I actually applied for the Xeric Foundation grant with this book, and I got it. You know, it was crazy. It was amazing. I still remember the day that I got it. I went out to my mailbox, and I opened it up. I pulled out this tiny little letter from the Xeric Foundation. I thought, oh, man. Because I thought it was going to be like college acceptances. So, when you're applying for college, You get a little envelope back, it's bad news. You get a big envelope back, it's good news. But then I open this up and I read that I'm about to get $3,000 of Turtles money to publish my own comic. It was amazing. It was better than getting a girlfriend. That's how amazing this was. So I put this out. My parents, meanwhile, watched me do this. They watched me put out my first comic book. And they were actually tolerant. I remember them calling me up after I sent them a copy of Gordon Moto and the King of Geeks, and they said, this is good. It is good that you get this out of your system before you move on to your real life. But unfortunately, it didn't get out of my system. I enjoyed the process of creating and putting out Gordon Moto and the King of Geeks so much that I wanted to do it again. So I earned a bunch of money of my own, and I used it to put out Gordon Moto and the King of Geeks #2 and #3. This was a ton of fun, but it also was not very lucrative. I told you earlier that I kept losing money at comics until American-Born Chinese came out. With these 3 books, I lost maybe $2,000 total. It was a lot of money going out of my door. My parents watched me do this. They watched me put out 2 and 3, and they were actually very annoyed. I remember them calling me up and them going, you are actually an adult now. What are you doing spending all your time on comics? And didn't we hear that kid that used to make comics with, that Jeremy kid, isn't he in med school right now? What are you doing with your life? Eventually, though, I kept making comics, and I eventually signed with my current publisher, First Second Books. First Second Books is in this very, very unique space in American books because it sits in between the world of comics, the world of trade books, and the world of libraries. First Second actually has really strong connections in all 3. And because of that, I feel really, really lucky to be with them. So I submitted to them in mid-2005. After that, they signed my first book with them, American-Born Chinese, which was published a year later. Since then, I've done a bunch of different books for them. Now, when American-Born Chinese came out in 2006, like I said, this was the life changer. This was the time when I stopped losing money in comics and I started making money in comics. This was a huge turning point for me. This was when I actually, at least in the eyes of my parents, had a career. I remember, when I, right after I graduated college, my dad used to do this on a regular basis. Every few months, I'd get this envelope from my dad. And it wouldn't have a letter in it. It would actually be newspaper clippings. It would be want ads from Apple Computer or Google. It'd be articles that compared teacher salaries to programmer salaries. Every few months I'd get it. Okay, American-Born Chinese, that's when it stopped, when American-Born Chinese came out. I remember exactly how it stopped. This Chinese language newspaper called the World Journal did a feature on me in their living section. And after that came out, I went to visit my dad, and he actually had this little article clipped out and laminated in a little folder. It was kind of sweet. So after American-Born Chinese came out, my parents were actually happy. Nowadays, my dad actually calls me to talk to me about comics. It's kind of a weird thing. I feel really uneasy about it, So did I actually do this? So did I actually navigate around this tension between East and West? Did I follow that authentic Christ? I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't know. I still hang out with a lot of my old InterVarsity friends. There's a group of us, actually, that all still live in the Bay Area. And every month, we get together at a Chinese restaurant in San Leandro just to hang out and have dinner together. We're all in our early 40s now, and we still talk about issues of calling. We still talk about doubt. We still talk about whether or not we regret our life choices. It's just a part of it. It's just a part of life, right? So I don't really know. There are times when I am super happy about being in comics. There are times when I am so sick of comics, I never want to see another cartoon ever again. So I don't really know. I don't think that publishing contracts or awards or even parent affirmation are a great way of measuring your life. I don't think it's a way of measuring self-donating love, right? And I don't even know if love in general is quantifiable. I don't know how you would measure whether or not you're successful in it. I think it's been 20 years since I've gotten out of college, and in those 20 years, I have gone through several periods of faith deconstruction and reconstruction. I feel like I'm on like a 5-year cycle. Every 5 years, I feel like I'm almost an atheist. I've also been at places where I'm like almost a Catholic fundamentalist. So I feel like I've fluctuated a lot between these different places in faith. And in that fluctuation, I think what I've come to realize is an authentic understanding of Christ is not above tension. It is not apart from tension. That the authentic Christ actually is usually in tension. It's not just in tension between Western faith and Eastern culture. It's like tension between anything. It could be between Republicans and Democrats. It can be between socialism and capitalism. It can be between mercy and justice. It's in that tension that you find the authentic Christ. And I think the reason that works is that when you try to live in tension, when you try to live in a way where you are not resolving tension, that's not your goal, you just want to live in it, you end up, it forces you to see both anchors of that tension in human terms. And when you do that, you will feel inadequate and you will realize your own need for self-donating love. And it's in that sort of moment that the authentic Christ appears. So I'm going to end with a short prayer from a Trappist monk. This is a prayer that I felt like has really helped me live in tension, in the different tensions in my life. I'm going to read it to you not as a prayer, I'm going to read it to you as a poem, as a piece of literature. And I want you to listen for both tension and self-donating love inside of this prayer. So Thomas Merton, he's a Trappist monk. He was actually a convert from atheism to Catholicism. He converted when he was in his early 30s, I believe. So Merton says, "My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you. And I hope that I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death." Oops, sorry, I lost my place. "I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone." So I encourage you, if you feel tension between two halves of yourself, whether it's Eastern culture and Western faith, whether it's between two political views that are a part of your family, whether it's between two different worldviews that are part of whatever social group you're in, try to live in that tension. Try to find the authentic Christ in that tension. Thank you so much for this time. It was a pleasure to talk to you all. Thank you.